Welcome everyone. Welcome to this Think Tank Europa webinar, where for the next 30 minutes we'll be talking about the digital economy, how the EU will be able to compete with the US and China, and what will be the main political priorities of the next coming years. And to do this, we're joined by Meyers, Assistant Director at the European Center for European Reform. Partially with a focus on digital policy and a background as a competition lawyer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Rasmus.
So you just published a very rich and interesting report on how to kickstart the European digital economy. And a lot of this is about the unfinished single market, which is a project that has been promised many times in many different strategies throughout the years, at least going back to the early 2000s. The Economist wrote an article about the digital single market as a phrase in 2018 and called it "waiting for Godot." And now it seems, even after all this new legislation coming out in recent years, it seems we are still waiting in some respects for a true digital single market. Next month, Enrico Letta, the former Prime Minister of Italy, will present his report on the single market as such, where the digital will also play a key role. When Letta visited Think Tank Europa last month, he said that the single market as a project has been somewhat forgotten, and it must now make a comeback. So, to begin with, Zach, why don't you explain, what is the urgency of this moment, and why is this time really different for the digital aspect of the single market?
Thanks, Rasmus. And I think that there is growing attention now on the EU's slow economic growth, and the difference in GDP growth between the US and Europe seems to be growing and getting worse. And it seems to be due to factors that in a large part Europe is kind of not able to tackle in the same way as the US. So, for example, a large part of the recent US economic growth is driven by industrial policy, and that's something that Europe has been really struggling to do, particularly at an EU level. Secondly, it's being driven by the US government's willingness to run huge deficits, which again is something that is anathema to a lot of Europeans. And thirdly, demographics seems to be a big problem. So the US has a kind of a much younger workforce, whereas Europe is older and it's harder to keep people in employment. And so it seems to me that the answer to all this has to be on what economists call total factor productivity, which is using technologies to make us work smarter, given that we're not going to just be able to work harder, or in other words, longer hours but with more people. And so I think that means that digitalization is really the essential tool here that we need to be able to better capitalize on and exploit if we want to keep our living standards going in the same way that they have in the past. So I am hopeful that there is a sense that amongst policymakers and lawmakers and in the next commission, that digitalization has to be the key focus.
Yeah, and you write in the very first sentence of your new report that there's a huge potential to unlock, I think you call it a thriving digital economy. Mm-hmm. So if we start with the diagnosis, what are then the specific barriers to a digital single market today, and why have then they, in a sense, not been removed already? What are the obstacles in place?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, if I can just kind of lay out that I think there's two ways that we should think about digitalization. One is having existing companies make better use of technologies that already exist today. And so, this is often forgotten because we focus so much on why doesn't the EU have its own tech giants like Facebook and Google, and less on the fact that when you're thinking about productivity growth and economic growth, that's really achieved by using technologies rather than just inventing them. And so that is one half of the problem, which is, I think, under addressed. And the second is obviously the more traditional question about how do we get European tech companies many of which are reasonably successful, and there's a growing number of startups. How do we get them to expand across Europe and eventually go global? And in terms of the barriers to this, I kind of lay out 3 in the report. The first is around the digital regulatory framework. And I think my key concern here, and this is probably echoed from a lot of smaller businesses particularly, is that it's just become immensely complex, and that the overlaps between laws, particularly those made in the last couple of years, is not very clear, especially when new laws have been proposed before existing ones have been properly bedded in. And so you have a focus much more on law making than on law implementation and enforcement. And that, I think that leads to a second problem, which is that this regulatory complexity means that we don't really have a single market in digital to the extent that we should. Part of this focus on lawmaking, I think, has led to a greater degree of willingness to allow member states to do their own thing when laws are getting passed. So whether that means kind of gold plating laws by going further than the EU standard is, having opt-outs, or in other cases, and I think this is the case with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, they've been designed so that particular countries like Germany and France can progress their own laws, which are slightly different or tackling the same problem in a different way. They get passed in parallel. And so I think that, the basis of the single market is regulation. And so I'm not at all opposed to more regulation if it's sensibly designed. But I think the focus has been too much on passing new laws rather than making sure that the laws are well designed, clear, easy to understand, and applied and implemented consistently and properly. The second 2 areas, which I'll cover really briefly, are how do we unlock a data economy? Because I think the focus of the Commission in the last few years has been on exploiting non-personal data, and they've passed a whole lot of laws which I think are genuinely well intentioned on things like making member states publish more of their data, encouraging different companies to voluntarily share and trade data, and putting in place kind of frameworks for data sharing. And I think this is all very sensible, but the problem is that most businesses are holding mixed data sets where the personal and the non-personal are mixed together and very difficult to segregate. And so I don't think that we have the right regulations and guidance in place to give companies confidence they can anonymize data or split out the personal and the non-personal and then go and exploit the non-personal data, which is what we would really want to see. And when you think about when GDPR was first proposed in Europe, lawmakers thought that it was going to unleash a whole lot of privacy-friendly data innovation in Europe, and that hasn't really happened. And I think we need to ask why and see whether there is more that we can do in terms of how GDPR is applied and interpreted to make sure that we are allowing space for innovation while making sure that we're protecting the kind of the fundamentals of GDPR. And the third thing is around digital infrastructure. So of course, we can have as many incentives in place for companies to use new technologies and invent them, but they're not going to, tech firms won't have a customer base if their customers don't have the connectivity that they need to get online and to use new technologies. And so what we need to make sure is that infrastructure is cheaply available, ubiquitous, and is really high quality and resilient. We've got some of that right. So I think that we have a competition environment in Europe, which has led to really low prices for connectivity. And we've also had pretty good rollout, especially in recent years. But when you look beyond the surface in terms of the quality of that rollout, it's quite mixed. So, I mean, a good example is 5G, where the rollout figures look great, but actually this has been achieved just by changing the antenna on the top of the 4G network. And when you think about the technologies that 5G enables, things like having industrial sensors so that you can kind of optimize manufacturing processes, you need kind of hundreds or thousands of those sensors to all connect to a single base point. And you can't do that unless the underlying infrastructure is not just kind of a 4G upgrade, but you've upgraded, the entire core network. This applies to a whole range of other different technologies that 5G could unleash as well. So we need to encourage kind of better quality and not just cheaper prices. And so to do that, I think we need to encourage telecoms companies to build more scale across Europe, which I think would be a better option than what some of them have proposed, which is in-country consolidation, which I think poses the risk of raising prices and making it harder for people to get online.
Yeah, digital infrastructure is definitely a key focus of the next commission, which we can see already now with white papers coming out of the commission. Let me just say first that if you have any questions for Zach during this webinar, you are very welcome to post them in the chat, and then we'll take them up in the conversation. But when it comes to digital infrastructure, this is one area, especially where previous efforts at creating a digital single market have failed, right? So the conversation is moving on. Now it seems to be increasingly about considerations for economic security, also competitiveness. There are some technological developments. You know, again, why is this time different in the way that we, or in the way the EU approaches digital infrastructure as a project of the single market, and what can we really expect from the coming commission in this area?
I think the white paper generally takes the right approach. So I was pleased that some proposals that I think are kind of questionable, like the idea that you should have digital technology companies, you know, like the Netflix of the world, paying telecoms companies for infrastructure. I think that raises a lot of questions around like the overall structure of the telecoms market and the internet, and whether things like net neutrality would come under stress in the future. So I'm glad that the Commission has moved away from that. And I think that the focus rightly is on kind of getting back to basics, which is making sure that we have a functioning telecoms single market. I mean, really, telecoms hasn't progressed much in terms of Europeanization over the past 20 years. You probably have a handful of companies that are operating across different member states, but you compare it to, say, the US or China, and you know, the big telecoms companies have hundreds of millions of customers. And I mean, I can't remember the exact figure, but in Europe, it's something like 5-10 million maybe. So they're just of a vastly smaller scale. And there is clearly, I think, a lot of benefit that can be had in making sure that these companies can do mergers that cross borders. And to do that, we need to make sure that it makes sense for them to do so, because I think the prevailing wisdom is that at the moment, there's not really that much benefit to having one company provide services in, say, Germany and France. And so I think that we should think about how we streamline regulations to make, you know, to ensure that there are better efficiencies. So, for example, I think in terms of consumer protection, each national telecoms regulator gets to kind of decide for themselves what standards they want to impose. And if we made those consistent, you could have more comparable retail offers. And then on the underlying infrastructure, I think on things like radio communications, cybersecurity, data retention. I mean, these are all areas where different countries just take wildly different approaches still. And if you want to run a single core network across different countries, you can't do that while you have law enforcement in one country saying you've got to hold data for a certain period of time, and then another in another country saying, oh no, you must hold it for longer. So I think, yeah, I don't think that it is anything hugely unsurprising or radical, but it's just that these areas that member states have insisted on keeping as their own national competences need to be addressed.
So a lot of this is about scale, as you say, which is also true of the general conversation about the digital single market, right? If we look at the actual white paper that you mentioned from the Commission on digital infrastructure, a lot of it is also about economic security, and sometimes ways to ensure an economic security that might go against considerations for competitiveness or classical considerations for open markets. So how do you think about this contradiction, if there is such? You know, how should we strike a balance between economic security, competitiveness? And this is also very relevant for a question that we got in the chat already from Seamus Allen, which is on, you know, the position for digital industrial policy in this whole policy mix with competitiveness, economic security. So how to strike that balance, and what role for industrial policy? in your
Yeah,
view?
I mean, I agree with you that there is an inevitable trade-off between, I mean, I don't like the word competitiveness, but maybe economic growth and economic security. We saw that just globally when the era of hyperglobalization was happening. We saw the highest economic growth, and now it's slowing down as globalization seems to be in retreat to some degree. And so I think that as policymakers, I think they just need to be honest about the trade-offs and show that there is a plan for growth at the same time. I think if you don't acknowledge these trade-offs, you're going to see more of what we've seen with the Green Lash, where there's been a real pushback against environmental legislation on the basis that it's going to make us poorer, and people are more worried now than ever before about maintaining their living standards. So I think we need to be careful about how insistent we are on economic security and in what areas. I think we focus very much on like a defensive play in terms of economic security, which is we're worried about particular dependencies that we have, whether that's on, particularly on like cloud computing seems to be a common one, where there's this idea that, we have to not use foreign suppliers so that we're not dependent on policy changes that might happen in other countries. But there is another side to economic security, which is focusing on the areas where others are dependent on us and making sure that we are strengthening those areas and ensuring that there's kind of mutual interdependence, if you will. And I think that there's probably much more that industrial policy can do in this second area. When you think about something like cloud computing, the companies that are the most successful in this area have global scale. The cloud computing aspect of their businesses is highly dependent on the fact that they have other very successful businesses that are global. Like they're not kind of standalone cloud computing companies, or at least they weren't at the start. And it's very difficult to see, in my mind, how European firms are going to be able to compete one for one with these kind of American hyperscalers. And so, I mean, we've tried that with Gaia-X, which was this plan to make different smaller European cloud companies work together so that collectively they could build a type of service portfolio that could compete with everything that Amazon can offer. But I don't think that's been hugely successful. And so I think that we should probably spend a bit more focus on building on our existing strengths. And you look at something like ASML, which is the Dutch chip equipment manufacturing firm, which really kind of has a chokehold on the types of manufacturing equipment that you need to make cutting edge chips. Now, China has spent kind of hundreds of billions of euros worth trying to replicate and create its own indigenous end-to-end supply chain for chips, and has been wildly unsuccessful at this. Like, I know we tend to get very frightened at the thought of in China's chip making progress, but I mean it's hard to overstate how expensive it's been and how little they've achieved compared to their initial targets. And so I think we should be looking at, what is it in this particular sector that means that we have such an advantage, which is hard for anyone else to replicate, and can we kind of build on that and expand the strengths to surrounding areas rather than try to make ourselves completely independent of foreign suppliers.
Trade-offs, as you say, is really the key word here, and this also goes across policy areas in the EU. So it can be easy for us to look at the digital area by itself and then identify what should be the priorities, how should we get there, but all of that requires investments, money, essentially, right? And we're having similar conversations about competitiveness, economic security, across sectors in energy, defense, clean tech, even for medicine now. If we broaden our focus a little bit, what role do you see for the digital aspect of this in the whole policy mix? How do you assess the priority that digital policy is given these days in the EU, and what does that mean for the EU's opportunities, options to in fact act in this area?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we need to think about the traditional drivers of European economic growth, which were in areas like car manufacturing and pharmaceuticals. And in these areas, it's obvious that China is growing up the supply chain. So, they're becoming technologically more sophisticated, and they have scale and a willingness to use industrial policy that Europe doesn't. And so it seems to me that the future of those sectors is going to be increasingly difficult over time, and the solution is probably not going to be to try to compete one for one with the policies that China is using, and instead we need to focus on what is our comparative strength going to be in the coming years. And that will have to be, as I said earlier, on kind of working smarter, not harder, and therefore on using digitalization to focus much more on things like services, where having niche expertise is going to be key. I mean, ASML is a great example here because, yes, it builds really complicated and expensive machines, but the service part of that business is also incredibly important too. And service and maintenance was a key part of the US export controls because the US understood that these machines are not going to be workable if you don't have extremely high skilled people who understand exactly how they work. So I think we have to orient towards a more services based economy, and digitalization has got to be a key part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And as you said in the beginning, one prerequisite for creating this more single market in the actual digital single market, as the project is called, is to perhaps lower the complexity and the overlap between all the regulations that have been implemented throughout recent years. So there's a lot of focus these days in the EU on implementation and also enforcement, right? And it seems that this will definitely be one track in the next Commission's policy program. There might be some slowdown to new legislation proposed, as you said. If you then were to envision another track, one where politicians and the commissioners will be able to say, this is our grand vision, a more, let's say, positive and proactive policy track, what do you expect that could be in the coming commission? What will be the digital project, so to speak, besides from better regulation, simplification, and enforcement?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. When I did the launch event for this report in Brussels a few weeks ago, we had some MEPs and a commission official, and they were very keen on thinking about, what are the next steps, what are the new laws that we are going to pass. And look, I think absolutely in areas like artificial intelligence, we don't really know what sort of regulations are going to be needed, and what has been passed, I think, we don't know whether it's going to be future-proofed yet. I have some doubts about this. So I think that there is certainly going to be a task for updating laws and hopefully, I think, making them a bit more principles-based and future-proofed, because I think some of the existing laws have been either too narrow or too focused on particular examples rather than giving companies real certainty about what the direction of travel is. So I'm maybe going to resist your question a little bit by saying that actually I think kind of getting the basics right and getting a bit more excitement about the single market and the fact that we need regulations to be applied consistently. I mean, it sounds like boring stuff, and it's not going to set the world on fire, but I think that it is kind of critical. If you're a small medium enterprise, you need to, in the tech sphere, you need to grow quickly and build scale, and it's very difficult for companies to do that if they're just staying within a single EU member state, and we need to change that.
Then I guess we'll leave it up for the politicians to communicate it in the right way and make a big fuss about it. And that's, I guess, also exactly one reason why Enrico Letta has been tasked with presenting this upcoming report, which is highly anticipated. And the telecoms market, we know, will be one important aspect of that. Here towards the end, you just mentioned that the digital legislation in the EU should be more principles-based and perhaps less specific. What do you mean by that? Could you elaborate on what does that mean in practice for how regulation will be formulated and what we will see in the coming years?
Yeah, I think we've seen some bad examples in recent years, but we've also seen some good examples, which I can use to kind of highlight what I have in mind. I mean, one of them is the Digital Services Act, where if you look at the way that companies have to tackle disinformation, the very largest platforms, that is, the focus is not so much on dictating what particular techniques they have to use to identify and eliminate disinformation, but it's much more on making sure that the companies are putting resources into this effort, making sure they recognize that it's a problem and allowing them to experiment. Because when you look at the academic literature, no expert will be able to tell you exactly what works in tackling disinformation. And sometimes the interventions that look like they are the most promising turn out to have completely the opposite effect. So, for example, when you put warning notes on particular posts that say that they're inaccurate, there's evidence that shows that people tend to then trust everything else that they see, which is obviously not a good outcome because most disinformation still doesn't have these tags on it. So I think we need to be kind of careful about being too prescriptive about what techniques companies should use to get to the outcome that we want, and we should focus more on the outcomes. And so I think that something like the Digital Services Act, where we have sticks in place so that these companies can get punished if they don't do the right thing and if they are not taking their obligations seriously, would be very helpful, and where they're required to be independently audited. And I think that is probably better than an approach that assumes that the Commission or some regulator is able to completely identify what should happen to tackle the problem in the first place.
All right. So one objection that is often being made to this argument you made, that this overall agenda in the EU, that regulation is slowing down in the digital area, that we should be focused on enforcing and not making a lot of new laws, is that digital technology is simply moving so fast these days that it's difficult also to catch up, so to speak, for the legislation, and new demands arise almost every year. I mean, 2 years ago, we didn't even have all the large language models around as we do today. So what do you say to this objection that the pace and the speed of the technology itself also is driving the political momentum and the new legislation?
I mean, firstly, I think we need to be careful about accepting that we need to move very quickly. I think when it comes to something like AI, there's been a lot of anxiety about the risks, and in my view, they're kind of somewhat overstated given the state of the technology at the moment. Like, what you have is basically advanced autocomplete, not a technology that's going to suddenly become autonomous or reach kind of a general level of intelligence. So I think that we can tend to kind of assume the worst of technologies and see only the risk rather than the opportunity. And so I think we should probably be cautious about assuming that we need to jump and regulate too quickly. But I think that obviously we do need to update regulations as technology changes. But really what we should have in place are laws that are, to go back to this point about being principles based, where we kind of already have a good sense about how the law should be applied to a new technology before it's put in place. And when I look at laws like the Digital Markets Act, what I see are, a law that puts in place a couple of rules that aim to solve antitrust problems that existed in the past. But it doesn't really give you a good sense about what are the overarching principles that we're going to use to make sure that future markets like AI and big data are going to be kept open and competitive, and so that small and medium enterprises have a chance to succeed. So I think if we take lawmaking a bit slower and we focus on principles, then we'll probably find that the work we need to do to adjust laws as new technologies get invented is probably less severe than it would have been if we were just focused on being very reactive.
Right. Well, that was a very clear answer. And it seems that the half hour has already run. It is 1 o'clock at least here in Copenhagen. So just I'll say thank you very much for all your input. It was very interesting. And this webinar will be made available as a recording after. so that it can be shared and or rewatched if if that's the case. But thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thanks, Rasmus. Bye.